Welcome everyone to the Next Gen 4 International Forum webinar. I apologize for our delay this morning. We're getting started a little bit late. We're having a little bit of connectivity issues with our presenter who's joining us today from France. By way of housekeeping, kind of a few things. There is a Q&A pod that you can type questions in during the presentation if you should have any questions. We will address the questions at the end as time allows. There is a file pod that if you click, the PDF slide deck of today's presentation will download directly to your computer station. And we, as always, welcome your feedback and invite you to participate in an online survey. And there is a link in the notes pod that will take you directly to SurveyMonkey where you can provide feedback. We appreciate the feedback, and we do endeavor to make improvements with each of the GIF webinars as we move forward. With that, I think we will go ahead and get started with today's presentation. Doing today's introduction is Dr. Patricia Pavier. She is the Director of the Office of Materials and Chemical Technologies at DOE-NE, and she's also the Chair of the Gen 4 International Forum Education and Training Task Force.
Thank you, Bertha, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to have here today Dr. Franco Michel-Sendis, who agreed to give this webinar. He's responsible for the coordination of the nuclear data services and criticality safety activities at the OECD NEA under the Data Bank and the Nuclear Science Division since 2010. From 2011 to 2016, he also served as NEA Scientific Secretary to the Generation 4 Steering Committee for the Molten Salt Reactor System. Dr. Michel-Sendis coordinated the 2015 NEA report, Introduction of Thorium in the Nuclear Fuel Cycle. He holds a BS and MS in Physics from the Universities of Paris and a PhD in Nuclear Reactor Physics from the University of Paris Sud Orsay. So thank you so much, Franco, for volunteering to give this seminar, and I give you the floor. Thank you again.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you for having me, and thank you, everybody, for attending. So first of all, I would like to start by saying some words about why it is that we are talking about thorium today. There is no doubt, some of you may have noticed, that the use of thorium as a nuclear fuel has become a fashionable topic in recent years again. This topic often provokes a debate between thorium proponents against thorium opponents that sometimes unfortunately takes place outside of the scientific arena for its most visible part, and that is the one taking place in the general media. So there's this situation of a low signal-to-noise ratio about the thorium question. And this can be perhaps understood by considering the fact that it would take a step back. We are a generation that presently has to face in our lifetimes a very complex and extremely important problem. And that problem is the one of quickly solving the planet's energy challenges while meeting climate goals of decarbonization of energy. All of that in a rather distressful post-Fukushima context for nuclear energy, where the solutions that can be proposed are sometimes already late, meaning that this added sense of urgency for action. So when faced with such complex problems, really the prospect of finding a miracle solution that just needs to be deployed is a concept that is very appealing to the mind. And if you consider this context in our internet era, where information can be spread around very quickly by non-specialists, then I would say that you have all the necessary ingredients to create a buzz. It is not my intention to take part into this anti versus pro thorium debate, but rather to give you the scientific basis today of why thorium can be interesting, but also to make you very aware of the many challenges that it's facing. And one of those challenges, a key aspect of one of those challenges, is how long it will take to develop and deploy thorium fuel technologies for them to be able to play a part of any solution. So is thorium a new miracle solution that is somehow of a super fuel that is cheaper than coal and that could have prevented Fukushima? Well, certainly not. And when you see this kind of publications, I would say that rather than to educate the public, what the target is just to sell their own books. So it would be an euphemism to say that misconceptions abound in the general media. Now, is thorium a trendy subject? These are just two graphs that I put one next to the other. I don't know if there is any relationship between them, but on the top one you can see the worldwide monthly popularity of search term thorium over time for the past 15 years in percentage of the maximum. And on the picture below, it is the evolution of uranium spot prices over time as given by the International Monetary Fund. Now you see that in the beginnings of the year 2000, just when the nuclear renaissance period was at its best, when uranium started to become very expensive, you can see a surge in the popularity, at least in the search term of popularity for thorium around the year 2005. I don't really explain why there is this surge around that year, but what I also noticed is that around the March 2011, the all-time popularity peak for thorium, at least in Google Trends, was reached. And this corresponds, of course, with the Fukushima incident. So this illustrates just the point that thorium becomes trendy whenever we are considering an alternative to uranium or an alternative way of making nuclear energy that is sometimes perceived as dangerous. So the purpose of this one-hour talk is really to give the audience a series of general elements around which you may build your own understanding of the question. So I will spend probably half of the presentation talking about the general scientific background on neutronics, talking about fissile and fertile nuclides and cycles. I will not dwell a lot on the historical context of thorium development, and I will give some general considerations on different aspects that are key to the understanding of the potentialities of any thorium or of any fuel cycle, really. So let's start from the beginning. All nuclides heavier than hydrogen, and that really means all nuclides, are created in stellar nucleosynthesis processes involving fusion for the lighter nuclides and neutron capture for the heavier ones. Nuclides heavier than lead are formed by very rapid sequential neutron capture processes that can only take place in neutron fluxes that are so high that they are only found in supernovae. The fluxes involved in these so-called OR processes are many, many orders of magnitude higher than the neutron fluxes found in a nuclear reactor, whatever its kind. So I would say it is perfectly accurate to say that the actinides that we can find on Earth were created long before the creation of our own solar system, and that this inventory was therefore fixed somehow at the creation of our sun and planets and has been decaying ever since. In particular, a concept that we can easily relate to is the internal heat of our planet, a significant fraction of which is produced by radioactive decay of the uranium and thorium isotopes that are found in the composition of the Earth's mantle and core. There are thousands of nuclides that we know of, most of which are unstable and decay with different modes and varying half-lives. This graph represents the familiar shape of the nuclide chart that classifies nuclides according to the number of neutrons on the x-axis and protons on the y-axis, and where each dot represents a nuclide whose properties have been measured. The color code here relates to different categories of half-lives depending on where each nuclide falls, ranging from milliseconds to billions of years. I appear to have lost connectivity. If Berta, can you forward to the next slide, where we have the animation of the nuclide chart. Thank you. I'm back. So if we animate this chart by going from very short half-lives in red to very long half-lives or stable nuclides that are depicted in black, we see that all nuclides decay down into what is called the valley of stability. What is represented here in black are nuclides whose half-life is greater than 1 billion years or that are stable. It is in this black series represented here that all isotopes naturally present on Earth in significant quantities are found, since our solar system was formed between 4 and 5 billion years ago. We notice in the upper right corner of the chart 2 dots that are separate from the group and that represent the most massive nuclides naturally found on Earth. They belong to the actinide family and are uranium-238 and thorium-232. Another important actinide, uranium-235, is not represented here since he didn't make the cut in the representation of the 1 billion year half-life threshold. The half-life of uranium-235 is only 700 million years, and that also explains why its proportion in the uranium mineral is so small. It is because it has decayed much faster. The 2 isotopes of uranium and thorium are the only 3 actinides found on Earth. Now, we also know from our understanding of the forces that tie nuclides together and of the resulting bounding energy per nucleon, which is represented here in the upper left, that only very heavy nuclides can fission and release energy by doing so. So if we were to look for candidate nuclides to be good fissile nuclides, we would necessarily have to look among the massive ones. It so happens that out of the 3 actinides that exist on Earth, only one is fissile with thermal neutrons, and that one is the shortest lived of all 3. It is uranium-235. So I have always found remarkable, even if today we understand very clearly why that is so, that out of the thousands of nuclides that can exist in the universe, there is in fact only one found on Earth that would allow us to start any nuclear energy era. In fact, we could say that the existence of nuclear fission technologies was a question of timing in the history of humanity on this planet. Had we been 2 billion years late, uranium-235 would have only been present in very small trace amounts, much more rare, more difficult, and more costly to mine. And in fact, if we had been 2 billion years before, the isotopics of natural uranium would have been much more favorable and very similar to what is found in present-day enriched uranium fuel that is needed for light water reactors. So that means between 3 and 4% of uranium-235 in the uranium mineral. This was demonstrated by CEA in France in the 1960s in somehow of an interesting story where routine radiochemical isotopic measurements of uranium samples extracted from a mine in Oklo in the Gabonese Republic found an abnormally low uranium-235 concentration. This was initially thought to be a mistake in the measurement, but it was later confirmed to be correct with subsequent investigations, and it was therefore proven that a very long-lasting and very low-powered continuous fission chain reaction had occurred naturally and without any human intervention inside the mine, where neutrons have been moderated by phreatic water currents at a time in history where the natural enrichment of the uranium mineral was around 3.6% of uranium-235. So the existence of sites within the mine where a natural fission reactor occurred was later confirmed by showing the existence of trace amounts of fission products. So it is clear that uranium-235 is the only possible match we have to start in the nuclear industry. In a moment, I will explain the concepts of fertile and fissile nuclides. You may think of fissile matter in a reactor as the match that allows you to initiate a wood fire. And once the wood fire is well started, you could always keep it running under certain conditions by adding more wood. In this very limited metaphor, the wood would be the fertile nuclide and the wood fire would be a functioning reactor. But you will always need a match fissile material to start the fire. So there's this false notion around that somehow the industry chose to develop the uranium fuel cycle in detriment of the thorium fuel cycle from the start, and that is something that is very naive and very easily discarded. Today, because we may happen to have fissile inventories that can be made available, we may consider the use of thorium, but always necessarily with an external fissile input that cannot be found in natural thorium. Thorium has no fissile isotope. So let me go back and make that point very clear. No uranium-235 means no nuclear fluid cycles of whatever kind would have been possible, because it also means no fissile plutonium, as plutonium is created in reactors. And if there is no fissile uranium and no fissile plutonium, it means there is no possibility at all of whatever kind of using thorium as a nuclear fuel. So the existence of today's nuclear industry and of any future nuclear industry is only made possible by the existence of uranium-235. So let's go back to our three actinides naturally found on Earth, which are displayed here as squares on the top of this slide. We have the two uranium isotopes, 235 and 238, and thorium-232. They have different half-lives, which, like we said, also directly impact their abundances on Earth. We will come back to this question of thorium resources, but for now, let's say that thorium is known to be abundant. That is not an issue. Now, only uranium-235 is fissile. I am representing in this graph in the lower right the neutron-induced reaction cross-section of uranium-235, which is an estimation of the likelihood of a nuclide to undergo a given nuclear reaction, in this case the fission reaction, upon the impact of a neutron. You will notice the logarithmic axis in both axes in this and other figures that I will be showing, and that gives you an idea of the very broad range of energies and cross-section magnitudes that can be considered. Now, I would like to take some time to explain an important concept that is central to the idea of regeneration of fissile matter within a reactor. Neutrons can not only trigger the fission of fissile nuclides, they can also be absorbed by a nucleus in a process that is called radiative neutron capture, where the absorption of the neutron is followed by the emission of gamma radiation. This reaction is represented here by the symbol N-gamma. Let's focus on the actinides that do not fission under thermal neutrons. They are the two on the right. Under neutron irradiation, they will absorb a neutron through radiative capture, transforming themselves into a shorter-lived isotope which will undergo beta decay. Notice how this sequence of neutron capture and two consecutive beta decay results for both uranium-238 and thorium-232 in the creation of fissile isotopes, which are respectively plutonium-239 and uranium-233. Because they can result in the production of a fissile isotope through the absorption of one neutron, these two nuclides, uranium-238 and thorium-232, are called fertile. This process establishes an important relationship between a given fertile nuclide and its resulting fissile isotope, which is at the basis of what we call the uranium-plutonium fuel cycle on one side and the thorium-uranium-233 fuel cycle on the other side. And this is the way these two fuel cycles have the potential to become self-sustainable in terms of fissile inventory needed. Now that we have established the similarities, let's focus a little bit on the differences. Notice that if the process is exactly the same in the case of uranium-238 and thorium-232, there is one significant difference to highlight. The immediate parent nuclide that will decay into uranium-233 is the nuclide protactinium-233, which is 10 times more long-lived than the immediate parent of plutonium-239, which is neptunium-239. So it's a little bit over 2 days half-life for Plutonium-239 in comparison to almost a month half-life for Protactinium-233. What does this mean? This means that by existing for longer times in the reactor, Protactinium-233 has much more chances to capture a neutron and not to decay into fissile uranium-233. Now, added to this longer half-life is also a higher capture cross-section than in the case of Neptunium-239, in particular about thermal energies. Protactinium-233 captures more. This is represented in the graph on the upper left. So this higher loss of fissile creation by protactinium capture has to be taken into account when considering thorium-based fuels. Now there can be some strategies imagined which all basically consist of taking the protactinium out of the neutron irradiation, either by targeting shorter burnups or for the most advanced reactor concepts which use liquid fuel, establishing online chemical filtering of protactiniums. As you may understand, these different strategies all represent very different challenges. Now, let's go back to, let's say that we have irradiated either uranium or thorium and that we now have somehow recovered the two corresponding fissile isotopes that have been created, so Plutonium-239 and Uranium-233 respectively. This graph shows here the comparison of fission cross-sections of these two nuclides in comparison to Uranium-235. Now, I'm showing here the same graph in an enlarged energy range, also covering the fast neutron energy range, and also considering the cross-sections of radiative neutron capture reactions, which are shown at the bottom, which are very important to consider for fissile nuclides as well, as they are in direct competition with fission. Let's highlight the two important energy regions where nuclear reactors typically operate. The fast energy regions for fast reactors is centered around 2 megaelectron volts, and a typical thermal neutron energy region is usually well below 1 electron volt. The first thing that we notice is that nuclear reaction cross-sections, in particular fission and capture cross-sections, exhibit a similar structure. So we have a smoother part, lower energies. Then you have a resonant part at intermediate energies. Here and there some individual resonances which can be very important. And then again a smoother part at fast energies. The second thing that we observe is that in order to make any sense of this, any qualitative assessment of on which one of these three nuclides is a better fissile, really would depend on looking rather at the ratio of these two competing reactions. And I will show later a graph showing a function of this ratio, but it also greatly depends on which neutron energy range you're looking at. So that means in which neutron spectrum is your reactor going to operate. And we will see in a minute that the two fuel cycles, either thorium or uranium, do exhibit some differences depending on which neutron spectrum we consider. But before we do that, let me just say one comment on neutron-induced fission. Here are three graphs that show very relevant nuclear data quantities that are essential, among many others, to our understanding and modeling of how reactors operate. And they are observables that are directly linked to the fission phenomenon. On the upper left, I have represented the fission product distribution resulting from fission of different nuclides: uranium-233, uranium-235, uranium-238, and plutonium-239. Now, I don't know if you can see which one is which, but the first thing to notice is that they all exhibit similar shape. There is some difference in the lighter mass peak on the left. As we know, the total power output of any reactor being directly proportional to the fission rate that is imposed on the system, this means that in terms of fission product production, there is very little difference regardless which fissile nuclide is considered. Consider the following graph on the bottom left, fission fragments will emit neutrons. And this is a typical sawtooth shape of neutrons emitted as a function of the mass number of the fission fragment. This is an essential contribution to the total average number of neutrons emitted per fission, usually called nu bar, and which is shown on the right as a function of neutron energy. The first thing to notice is that there is the green curve that is clearly above the others. It corresponds to the average number of neutrons emitted by the fission of plutonium-239. The other three curves are closer together, but all of them stay clearly above the value of 2. And this fact, the fact that nu bar is greater than 2, has huge implications, which we will briefly mention now. The first of them is that under the right conditions, a pile of fissile material can become critical and sustain a continuous fission chain reaction. This is why, therefore, they were called reactors. It's interesting to note, really, that this word nuclear reactor did not exist from the beginning. They were called piles in the 1940s. Now, the fact that nu bar is greater than 2 makes the concept of breathing possible. What is breathing? A breather reactor is a reactor which compensates the loss of fissile material burnt during its normal operation by making sure or enable that an equivalent or higher amount of neutron captures in the fertile nuclides happen, since these will result, on a first approximation, in the creation of fissile nuclides and will therefore compensate the initial fissile losses. Now, it can be easily demonstrated that, again, under a first approximation, which is not a sufficient but a necessary condition, it can be shown that breathing can only be possible when the following quantity displayed here, and the quantity is nu bar minus 2 factor of 1 plus alpha. Alpha is the ratio of the capture to fission average cross-section values for the fissile nuclide. When this equation is greater than 0. Now, this simply states that there needs to be enough neutrons left after fission to compensate the fissile losses. It doesn't ensure that these neutrons will end up being absorbed by a fertile nuclide, but certainly if this quantity is negative, then certainly breathing cannot happen. The neutron economy would not allow for it. Now, this quantity is interesting because it only depends, like I said, on the properties of the fissile nuclide, and because we can plot it as a function of neutron energy for both of the fissile nuclides of interest, which relate to both fuel cycles. So this is what I'm showing in this graph here. Uranium-233 for the thorium fuel cycle and plutonium-239 for the uranium fuel cycle. We display here the same quantity in continuous energy and using a multi-group energy structure for easier readability, as it is usually hard to make any sense visually of the resonance region. So we see that the green curve, which represents the thorium-uranium fuel cycle, stays above 0, although not by a very large margin, meaning that neutron economy theoretically allows breathing, but remains very tight, while that is not the case for the blue curve, which represents the uranium-plutonium fuel cycle, which becomes clearly negative at thermal and intermediate energies, but on the other hand is clearly superior in the fast neutron energy range. So I'm highlighting these two energy ranges here. Now this is just some calculated numbers of the previous graph in what I call a quick and dirty napkin calculation, just to show orders of magnitude. Here, the choice of spectra is perhaps not the best because I did it with Maxwellian thermal and a Watt fission spectrum, which are not real neutron distributions found in reactors, but it is what I have in hand to illustrate the point. So we see that a positive number of neutrons available for breathing in the case of the thorium-uranium fuel cycle, and a much more favorable value for the uranium-plutonium fuel cycle in the fast range. and an almost null and very often negative value for uranium-plutonium in thermal spectra. Here's another interesting quick and dirty calculation that we can do in order only to see potential differences in the orders of magnitude between both cycles. And that the quantity relates to the initial concentration of fissile matter that we need to establish breathing. And this directly relates to the amount of matter needed to start a breather reactor, and is therefore a very important parameter. Now, if we suppose that breathing conditions are true, then we can suppose on a first approximation, again, that the equation on the top is true, that the rate of capture in the fertile nuclide equals the rate of losses of the fissile nuclide. Now, it is easy to show that this establishes a relationship between the concentrations of fissile matter as a function of the cross-sections of the nuclide in the fuel that will depend on the average cross-section values and therefore of the neutron spectrum considered. This is the quantity that I'm representing here, and this quantity called C-Fis, concentration of fissile. Now, this is something that we can also plot as a function of energy, and this is what I am representing here, where we see that the values for the thermal region, I'm going to try to grab the arrow. The values for the thermal region for the thorium fuel cycle are around of the order of the percent, whereas the values found for breathing conditions for both fuel cycles in the fast energy spectrum are more of the order of 10%. Notice, however, that since we established this expression assuming breathing, since the neutron economy of the uranium-plutonium cycle does not allow breathing condition, the red curve in this region here, in the thermal region, does not really represent anything and should be ignored. So what we have established is really lower concentration of fissiles theoretically for the thorium fuel cycle and higher ones indifferently for both cycles in the fast region. If we run some numbers again with simulated neutron spectra for this quantity, here are the values that we found, which confirm our observation around the value of 2% for thorium uranium 233 fuel cycle. There is not a thermal column for uranium plutonium 39 since it does not allow breathing, and we see that similarly 10–11% theoretical values for both fuel cycles in the fast energy range. Of course, this is only true provided all other technological and safety aspects allow for it, of course. So, by now, we have established that there could possibly be a thorium thermal breather. And why is this such a big deal? Well, we have theoretically established that two important advantages of the thorium fuel cycle that are clearly behind the historical interest in thorium. One is that breathing conditions can exist in thermal spectrum for thorium uranium 233 fuel cycle. And this is important because thermal neutron technologies are the existing technologies that we know are very developed, and they have more operational experience at the time and still today, although today fast breather reactors exist. Second, because in the case that they are demonstrated, it could be expected that the initial fissile quantity needed to start such breather reactors could potentially be much lower than the one needed by fast breather reactors. So these really are the reasons that, in my view, motivate the study of the thorium fuel cycle and that have motivated the study of the thorium fuel cycle since the beginning of the nuclear energy era. We should say, however, highlight again, in order to be fair, that the uranium-plutonium fuel cycle clearly exhibits a more favorable neutron economy in fast spectra. So let's keep these aspects in mind as we now leave the pure neutronic side to review some other aspects of thorium-based fuels. A well-known issue related to irradiated thorium-based fuels is the presence of a strong gamma emitter that is found in the decay chains of both thorium-232 and uranium-232. Uranium-232 can be created through end-to-end reactions on uranium-233, and even in small proportions, the presence of uranium-232 is known to pose a radiological issue. In particular, the very energetic gamma line at 2.6 MeV, which is displayed here as part of the discrete gamma spectra emitted by thallium-208, poses severe shielding issues which would require remote handling facilities of irradiated fuel. Here's a picture of such a facility. Here's the Atalante hot cell lab at CA Marcoule. Needless to say, these type of facilities are very costly, and there is currently no experience of the use of these facilities at the industrial scale needed if thorium fuel cycles were to be developed. Now, we will come back to this point later. Now, whenever we are comparing the properties of, let's say, two nuclides, and even more for two entire fuel cycles, there will be some obvious similarities and some differences. And what I have often found in literature is that sometimes these differences are given a twist. Whether you are a thorium defender or a thorium opponent, you will portray this difference in a positive or a negative way. So what we usually hear is that, oh, is there is uranium-232 content in irradiated thorium fuels? Is it very, very high content? That's excellent news, you know, because it makes uranium-233 fuel proliferation resistance. So let me just say that I will stick to what the IAEA says concerning the Convention of the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials. Uranium-233 is an excellent fissile nuclide, and it is categorized under the same basis as plutonium. So really, the claims that high uranium-232 content in irradiated thorium fuels would be self-protecting is really a modest anti-proliferation claim in my view, and not a really compelling argument. And the reason is that the degree to which this protects against the theft of uranium-233 depends on the threat scenario, the facilities available, and the willingness of proliferators to, to take a risk and expose themselves to a radiological dose. Now we know that there are very significant dose rates to personnel, but they do not guarantee to cause rapid incapacitation. Irradiation from thallium-208. I'm sorry, there's a typo in there. So this situation is rather a very serious remote handling issue for fuel fabrication and processes, rather than an asset for anti-proliferation claims. In order to be careful and prudent, we should say that proliferation resistance of thorium fuel cycles are more likely to be comparable to uranium-plutonium fuel cycles. So really, it is incorrect to assert that thorium fuel cycle is proliferation proof. There are other thorium properties that we can mention, and it is useful to compare the properties of thorium dioxide, which is a ceramic material also referred to as thoria, versus those of uranium dioxide, as these forms would be the preferred forms for solid fuels. Thorium dioxide ceramics over uranium dioxides. This is well known. They have a higher melting point of the order of 3,300 Celsius centigrades versus 2,800 Celsius for uranium dioxide. They have a higher thermal conductivity that can result in lower fuel operating temperatures. Thoria is chemically stable. It is in its highest oxidation state. It means it does not oxidize when it is exposed to water or steam or air at high temperatures, and this is not the case for uranium dioxide. Thoria is known to have some higher fission product retention in thoria matrices, and these are interesting aspects that may translate into fuel performance improvements under the normal operating conditions of a reactor, but also in postulated action scenarios. Now, whenever we say that thoria is chemically stable, this is a difference that we also translate into known difficulties at the reprocessing stage of thorium-based fuels, which are much more difficult to dissolve, and this is a well-known issue. But it's nevertheless very interesting to consider the use of thorium-based fuels in existing reactors, also because it is logically the first implementation that thorium could realistically have, really to start using thorium in the existing platform of reactors. For the reasons cited in the previous slide, thorium-based fuels for light water reactors and pressurized heavy water reactors exhibit improved defect performance in terms of reduced fission product release and are highly prospective technology for consuming or transmuting transuranic, that means plutonium plus minor actinide nuclides. However, thorium-based fuels must first be qualified to assure that they can perform safely in a reactor. So that means they have to go through a qualification and licensing process before we can start implementing them into the industry. These processes will require significant further development and test programs to manufacture and ensure that we have optimal thorium-based fuels for industry use. There is a private company called Thor Energy, which is part of a consortium that is conducting presently irradiation tests of thorium-based fuels at the OECD Halden reactor in Norway. And this is a picture of showing, they are at the stage of showing that the fabrication process of thorium-based pellets is correctly done. Now, minor actinide production. One often claimed advantage of the thorium fuel cycles is that it produces less plutonium and other actinides, which significantly reduce the radiotoxicity of the waste. This is absolutely true, and it's well understood by the fact that thorium-232 is 6 atomic masses below uranium-238, and that leads to a less likelihood of production of higher mass plutonium and minor actinides, because simply they will need 6 subsequent neutron captures on the fuel, which makes it less likely. This is true for a pure thorium-uranium-233 cycle. It is not clear for other forms of fuel, which are the transition fuels that must be used if we are to transition to the long-term thorium-uranium-233 fuel cycle. Remember that uranium-233 does not exist, and we must find a way of producing it by using other fissile seeds in thorium. This is a very simple example of a calculation showing a comparison of 3 types of fuel for the same discharge burnup. We can see that in the case of thorium is used with plutonium, there is a much increase of minor actinide production per unit energy produced. It is less clear for thorium using enriched uranium fuel as compared to to standard MOX fuels. I'm sorry. Now, let me show you just an exercise calculation dealing with radiotoxicity of spent nuclear fuel. It is well known that minor actinide production drives the long-term radiotoxicity of spent fuel. What is shown here is the same type of calculation conducted for the same type of fuel at the same, for the same type of reactor using different types of fuel at the same discharge burnup. And we can clearly see that for the long term, in the case of once-through fuel implementations, that means that there is no uranium-233 recycle in the case of the thorium-based fuels here, we can see that the radiotoxicity of thorium-uranium-233 PWR fuel in this example peaks at a time of around 100,000 and 200,000 years, and peaks above all the radiotoxicity of all the other fuels represented here. So really the message here is that this type of comparison really depend on the type of strategies and the type of fuels and the types of fuel management scenarios that are used in order to really make any sense. The relative differences between radiotoxicities resulting from the use of both cycles vary greatly, like I said, depending on recycling strategies and recycling efficiencies considered, and must therefore be interpreted with great caution. Also, an unusual lack in the analysis that I sometimes show is the consideration of the very long transition period that must take place using other forms of fuel, for instance, thorium, plutonium, thorium, uranium, enriched uranium fuels. And this long transition phase must be considered and integrated into the comparison for any comparison to be meaningful. So I would say that unless it is clearly demonstrated and we really specify which type of strategies we're considering, which type of reactors and which type of fuel, and including fuel enrichment we are considering, if we are to say a general conclusion, that would be that the long-term radiotoxicity of thorium-based spent nuclear fuel is therefore more honestly described as being comparable to that of uranium-based spent nuclear fuel. Again, it will depend on the specifics of the scenario and of the specifics of the fuel and type of reactor. Yes, the longer term pure thorium uranium-233 fuel cycle, because it has less minor actinide production, could lead to advantages in long-term radiotoxicity. Now let's speed up a little bit. Thorium fuel reprocessing. We have already mentioned the characteristic of thorium fuel that would be considered an advantage for fuel behavior. They will pose a challenge when reprocessing, because the same stability that gives thorium the advantages for a good behavior in reactor makes it very difficult to dissolve. There are processes that have been used at a laboratory scale, at a pilot scale. This is the so-called Thorex dissolution processes. It is a process that requires the combination of very corrosive hydrofluoric and nitric acids that has not been demonstrated at an industrial scale at all. So there is some little experience with Thorex that does not compare to the very large existing Purex industrial experience that exists for instance, for recycling of uranium spent fuel and MOX. Pyroprocessing has only been used at the laboratory scale only, and really basic data is still needed. There is a lot of R&D still needed before a demonstration of these processes of thorium-based fuel reprocessing could happen at an industrial scale. There is the technology nor the understanding is mature enough behind. This also will impact the refabrication of used thorium fuel. As we mentioned, irradiated thorium fuel refabrication will be severely complicated by the presence of uranium-232 decay daughters, which with highly penetrating gammas. Some studies show that U-232 abundances can be as high as in the order of thousands of parts per million. And this is just to compare the current experience that we have with reprocessed uranium fuel fabrication is one that considers concentrations of U-232 of less than 0.01 parts per million, at which the radiological dose is already significant. This very high abundance of uranium-232 will pose an irradiation hazard, not only a contamination hazard, so that refabrication processes cannot be done in glove boxes like they are done for MOX fuels. In this case, like we mentioned, remote operation and shielding will be required, and these are very costly processes, and they have not had any industrial demonstration. Let me highlight that the lack of industrially sound processes for the reprocessing and refabrication of thorium fuels is a very, very significant impediment, an obstacle to closing the fuel cycle and closing the thorium fuel cycle, and therefore of implementing a clear driver to go towards that fuel cycle from the start. Now, in the past, of course, many reactors have used thorium-based fuels. I will not dwell a long time on detailing all of these aspects. This can be found in literature, and it's interesting to consider the experience that we have had in the past with this type of reactors and fuels. Let me just mention that a thermal breather, pressurized water reactor with thorium uranium-233 has functioned in the past. This is the case of the Shippingport power station. Shippingport was the very first commercial PWR that was adapted at the end of its lifetime to use thorium fuel from 1977 to 1982 demonstrated breathing in using the thermal spectrum. Now, the shipping port fuel management strategy used a very complex geometry of axial and radial zoning, different types of fuel in blanket assemblies, no use of control rods. Basically, everything that could capture a neutron outside of the fertile element was discarded. This made for a very, very complex way of operating a reactor. What it was an engineering feat to prove that breathing in a thermal spectrum could occur. This was proven by post-irradiation analysis, which revealed 1.4% more fissile content in spent fuel than initially loaded. It was also proven to be extremely complicated, and our understanding today is that this would not be a way of operating a commercial reactor, nor it could be licensed for safety reasons, for instance. There is, of course, the well-known existence of the MSBR thermal breather project. It was a paper reactor that was under study in the 60s, specifically in Oak Ridge. I will go very quickly on this one, as there was a previous webinar on molten cell reactors. What I would say is that really at the end of the 70s, the banning of spent fuel reprocessing by the US effectively terminated the possibilities to close the fuel cycle, and also terminated the funding for these types of studies. Now, these types of studies around molten cell reactors were started again at least 15 years ago in France, particularly at the CNRS. Again, I will mention, I will direct you to the past webinar by Professor Elsa Merle in May that really went into much more detail about these concepts. In fact, I have taken this slide from her presentation. Just to mention that these studies have started from considering a thermal spectrum molten cell reactor, which was found to pose many problems in the design, really by exhibiting a positive feedback coefficient, which is something that is completely forbidden for any reactor to operate safely or even to be seriously considered. And they also studied some epithermal spectrum configurations, so intermediate spectrum configurations that apparently resulted in the very short graphite lifespan that, of course, poses the question of the economic viability of the concept. So currently, the molten salt reactor group within the Generation 4 International Forum is studying a fast spectrum configuration which has no moderator. It is a breather concept. However, I would mention that by switching to a fast neutron spectrum, we are losing the potential advantages of the theoretical advantages of the thorium in the thermal spectrum. But it appears that at least for this particular concept, there really was no other alternative. Let me just say that the molten salt fast reactor is today the reference concept studied in the Generation 4 International Forum, and it does consider different fuel types to be started, that use uranium-233, of course, but also enriched uranium and also MOX. Again, for a much more detailed presentation, please go and see the seminar by Professor Merle. Now, let me just mention before we move on that there are some very specific technological concepts studied under molten salts that are not really linked to the fact that a reactor would use thorium. So molten salts can be used by reactors using uranium, or they can be used as salts, or they can be used in other applications. So this development of molten salt reactors will have applications even outside of a thorium implementation. We do not need to necessarily reach breathing. It could be interesting to reach simply higher conversion for the sake of improving the use of fissile resources, and also to improve the volume of waste per unit energy produced. This is a concept behind the high conversion systems that are also under study. These are evolutionary concepts of existing reactors, such as CANDUs or boiling water reactors, and they all revolve about the idea of hardening the neutron spectrum a little bit to go into neutron energy ranges that are a little bit more favorable to the use of fissile resources. I seem to have lost connectivity here. I apologize. I hope that you are still seeing the slides. Let me just continue by saying that these high conversion systems can exhibit reduced fissile requirements. They would represent a step towards sustainability. And really, the fact that they consider the use on once-through fuel cycles makes it simpler to really start the development in that direction. In the longer term, breeder systems can eventually get to a self-sustaining mode of operation with zero fissile requirement. This is achievable only after a very long transition period, which would require input of neutrons from other fissile materials, which today the only ones considered really are enriched uranium or plutonium. A side note is that the utilization of thorium with enriched uranium as is in the current reactors seems to be not economically viable, really. And of course, closing the fuel cycle will be needed before any breeder reactor can operate. This supposes that we dominate or know how to do the recycling of spent fuel and fuel refabrication. Here's just a very conceptual graph that the message of which really is that if we are to develop thorium fuel technologies into the future, they will take many years and resources. Many years because there will be a duration in time during which we need to breed uranium-233 before it can be made available to put in use into other systems. And many resources, of course, because there are a lot of studies that are still needed, and these will start small before they can become bigger. So the idea, if we were to foresee what the applications in the future of thorium fuels would be, it is really to start in once-through fuel cycles, perhaps by using the easiest initial step would be not to couple chemically those cycles. That means to keep thorium fertile rods separate from mixing the fuel with plutonium since in fact there is no reprocessing still available. And as time develops, as we find more solutions to these questions, we could start implementing these mixed fuel forms in once-through thorium plutonium or in once-through high conversion systems if these systems arise. Really up to a stage, if thorium fuel reprocessing and recycle becomes a reality or a viable reality, that would open the door to considering really closing the fuel cycles with dedicated high conversion systems or even breeder reactors. But in any case, the pure thorium uranium-233 fuel cycle with online reprocessing, such as is the case of molten salt reactors, would be a very long-term prospect. Now, what would be the drivers today, really the incentives to make the industry go into that direction, where we could identify just basically the fact of improving fissile resource utilization. This could have some added benefits in terms of waste volumes, but also in order to develop plutonium management alternatives. And as we will see, if we are competing against fast breeder reactors which require plutonium, the fact that for whatever reasons these fast breeder reactors may not take place, if a country, for instance, starts developing plutonium and then decides to step away from nuclear energy, then plutonium management alternatives would be very useful. And here's where thorium fuels could play a role. In any case, the message here is it will take a very long progressive time, and clear drivers still need to be identified. This is very well illustrated by the Indian strategy, which considers an inherently long transition process to a thorium fuel cycle. Here, I will not detail the different reactors and different strategies here. The basic message is that nations that have the will to go into that direction necessarily consider that this can only be done really towards the end of the century and will require several types of reactors to function together symbiotically. Now, it is interesting to note that very recently India has bought uranium fuel light water reactor technology. So whether this means that they are stepping away from this thorium fuel cycle direction or simply strengthening their capacity for electricity production, really it is not for me to comment. Whatever happens, what we know is that in the next couple of decades we will be decommissioning existing nuclear reactors in the hundreds. Whether nuclear energy gets to play a role for the future strategies that may result in achieving climate goals really has to be decided now. So in that sense, we do not have the time to consider solutions that would take many decades yet to be proven. Here's just a picture showing that really the final answer to the world's energy problems will be a mix of different energy sources, and we can consider whether nuclear has to play a larger part. Really, again, like I said, it is technologies that are ready today that will at least exist for the remaining part of this century that need to be deployed. That we must consider that when thinking about thorium solutions, really. Let me just say one thing about resource availability of thorium. I have willingly kept this at the end because whenever you listen to any thorium presentation, many of them, they start by saying thorium is very abundant and this is why we're using or considering its use. Really, it is difficult to compare uranium and thorium resources for one very simple reason, is that categories of uranium resources actually depend on the price of extraction that one is willing to pay, and therefore on the uranium market. Now, since there is no standard classification for thorium resources, that is because there is no thorium market, there is no thorium spot price. This has also resulted in the fact that thorium has not been as prospected as uranium, and really, in order to be correct, we should say that our current knowledge of thorium resources is incomplete. Nevertheless, it is very safe to assume that the exploitable uranium and thorium mineral resources really are of the same order of magnitude, that means several million tons. And I would like here to make a note that a few people consider really is that we are nowhere near the need of mining so much thorium that we are of mining uranium. Because when we mine for uranium, we are actually mining to get the 0.7% of uranium-235 in the mineral. So that means that whatever thorium mining requirements would exist in the future, they would be orders of magnitude less than those that we know of uranium. Really, we are not mining, again, for the fertile uranium. We have tons of fertile uranium, impoverished uranium after the enrichment process that are just sitting there. If we were to mine for fertile thorium, if we needed to mine for 1 ton of fertile thorium, we would just need to mine 1 ton. The current ratio is for 1 ton of enriched fuel, we need to mine for approximately 100 tons of uranium. So this will not be the case in the case of thorium. There is currently a limited non-nuclear thorium market, and few incentives exist to open new mines with thorium as a primary product. Nevertheless, we already know that the near future thorium recovery will utilize pre-existing mining operations which currently surface thorium but route it to waste because of the very small demand. This is a very important aspect because the byproduct production of thorium from other industrial mining activities such as rare earth production can provide more than ample quantities of thorium for whatever potential use of thorium in the nuclear industry for the foreseeable future. This picture should make it clear. for the past 20 years, we have had our change in our habits. We're using electronic devices, we're using smartphones, we're using computers, we're using a lot of different screens. All of these devices, they require rare earths in order to be fabricated. And as a result, there has been a huge explosion in the production of rare earth mining. Here's a graph that shows the progression in the past 30 years or so. Notice the magnitudes that are in the hundreds, thousands of millions of tons. This is rare earth production in China and the US. Nowadays, without any doubt, China is the leader of rare earth production. The message here is that if only one small fraction percentage of this rare earth production results in byproduct production of thorium, then there is no problem in providing thorium for any kind of nuclear application in the future. This is a picture of a thorium sitting in some stocking place, waiting to be used or waiting for a reason to be used. We should also mention the resource availability of uranium, since thorium is always considered in case of there is uranium scarcity. Now, as the years go by and as prospection of uranium continues, our understanding of resources gets better, and in fact, we seem to be finding more and more. This is a compilation from numbers found in the IAEA, NEA, uranium production and demand books. They're also called the Red Books. I'm just going to read that conclusion from the Red Book, which says, regardless of the role that nuclear energy ultimately plays in meeting future electricity demand, the uranium resource base is more than adequate to meet projected requirements for the foreseeable future. Let me prepare to conclude. I hope you will have understood by now that the thorium question is a very complex question, that the thorium-uranium-233 fuel cycle is a long-term endeavor if we ever get there. In order to get there, we must develop or find the drivers to develop thorium-based fuels. But the question would be really to say for which system, in which fuel form, in which fuel management strategy, in which deployment scenario, for which drivers and for which objectives. And if we want to speak of thorium more precisely and of a less general form, we will need to answer these questions before we can draw stronger conclusions. Really. Thorium fuel cycle is based on a uranium-233, a non-existing fissile nuclide which can be bred, provided thorium is first used with all the fissile seeds and for a very long transition time. It is certainly neutronically interesting. It is chemically very complex. It is today technologically and industrially yet unsound, and it is economically uncertain. Really, is the thorium question the wrong question? Failure to look at the complete picture, if we just enumerate latent advantages or disadvantages of a resource, we are confusing the question with the real question, which is the readiness of a technology, really. One does not retrieve energy from a mineral, one does not retrieve energy from a rock, one retrieves energy from an industrial technology that has to be economically competitive for it to be deployed and supported. In order to meet climate challenges at the scale needed, nuclear industry needs to provide flexible and well-financed industrial strategies to deploy its solutions, in plural, in the appropriate timescales. So can thorium play a part in the answers nuclear industry needs to provide? That, I think, would be the more correct question. We would need to consider the competition from other advanced reactor systems or Generation 4 systems, which really today still exhibit an uncertainty around the readiness of the technology. Also, an uncertainty around the fissile inventory needs for deployment that would also be very important in order to quantify their sustainability. But really the message is that there is no skipping in the generation. Before we go to Generation 4, we will need to deploy and understand and correctly operate Generation 3 and 3+. The introduction of thorium into nuclear energy system, if it occurs, will need to happen progressively. None of the scenarios currently envisaging a full transition towards a pure thorium-uranium-233 fuel cycle in the near or medium term are realistic, both for scientific and for industrial reasons. Any industrial application of thorium as a nuclear fuel would continue to require the input of fissile materials from the existing uranium-plutonium cycle until the required amounts of uranium-233 could be produced and ultimately make the thorium cycle self-sustaining. Now we have to consider that before we go into that direction, there will be competition from other systems, such as fast-breeder reactors that require plutonium. We currently see that the strongest case for thorium fuels is thorium-plutonium fuels. And the limitations imposed by fissile plutonium availability point to very long transition periods that would also need to consider whether we want to burn plutonium in thorium instead of saving it for future development of fast-breeder reactors. So these are really national strategies that need to be decided among the nuclear nations. With uncertainties around large-scale deployment of fast reactor and the lack of geological repositories, we see that alternate plutonium management strategies can arise as valuable options. The introduction of thorium-based fuels can represent a credible option for plutonium management solutions for the existing technological platform, while also providing potential better utilization of fissile resources in high conversion systems. So thorium can play a role in enhancing the flexibility of future nuclear energy systems through symbiotic scenarios, although very significant R&D is still needed, and for this to happen, we would need to identify the proper economic incentives. With the lack of clear short-term economic incentives and no change in preferred future strategies, we must be aware that the present industrial development of thorium is likely to remain very limited. I hope I have made it clear to you that thorium is clearly no silver bullet. And this is perhaps the chance of thorium, because utilities are not looking for silver bullets. Really, they are looking for options, and options have value in an uncertain context. In this sense, thorium options should be kept open insofar it represents an interesting complement to the uranium fuel cycle to strengthen the sustainability of nuclear energy in the medium to longer term, but certainly not to replace it. Again, we can see that the fuel recycle requiring thorex reprocessing and remote fuel fabrication still need to be proven industrially. In general, the closed uranium-233 thorium cycle will be best realized in Generation 4 systems, especially multi-cell reactors, but this is only viable on a long time scale if we ever choose to go into that direction. I would like now to finish my presentation by quoting a famous remark by Admiral Rickover when he was addressing Congress in June 1953. Admiral Rickover was known as the father of nuclear navy and also involved in the shipping port building of the power station. So I will just read if you allow me. Important decisions about the future development of atomic power must frequently be made by people who do not necessarily have an intimate knowledge of the technical aspects of reactors. These people are, nonetheless, interested in what a reactor plant will do, how much it will cost, how long it will take to build, and how long and how well it will operate. When they attempt to learn these things, there appears to be unresolved conflict on almost every issue that arises. I believe that this confusion stems from a failure to distinguish between the academic and the practical. An academic reactor almost always has the following basic characteristics. It is simple, it is small, it is cheap, it is light, it can be built very quickly, it is very flexible in purpose. Very little development is required. The reactor is in the study phase. It is not being built now. A practical reactor, on the other hand, it's being built now. It is behind schedule. It is requiring an immense amount of development on apparently trivial items. Corrosion, in particular, is a problem. It is very expensive. It takes a long time to build because of engineering problems. It is large, it is heavy, it is complicated. It is worthwhile to bear in mind this distinction and to be guided thereby. I would like to thank you very much for your attention. If you would like to learn more, please consult the two reports I have based my presentation today on. These are two reports that we published in 2015, and you can find them for free in the OECD NEA website. Here are, for reference, some other studies. Visit our sites or send me an email. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Franco. Thank you very much for your presentation. If you have questions regarding any of the material in today's presentation, please feel free to type that in the Q&A pod now, and we'll take those questions as we have time. While you're typing in questions, let's just take a quick look at the upcoming webinars in August. Metallic Fuels for SFRs by Dr. Stephen Hayes. In September, Energy Conversion by Dr. Richard Stainsby. And Dr. Jeffrey Rothwell will present Economics of the Nuclear Fuel Cycle in October. I see some comments coming in. Do you see those as well, Franco? In the Q&A pod, there are those two tabs. One is the participant view and one is the presenter view. So I will share.
I don't see questions. I see some comments.
Yep, some accolades are coming in.
They seem to be appreciation comments, which thank you very much. Okay. Do you see anything?
There's one. Thanks very much for your presentation. My question is, what does the thorium produced in China? What is the thorium produced in China used for?
Okay, I guess that has to do with a slide I showed. Currently, there is, which would be this one, showing a graph of rare earth production. So this, perhaps I did not make myself clear. This is the production of rare earth in China for other applications which are non-nuclear at all. Thorium is not part of this rare earth, but it is a byproduct production of this mining industry. So currently, I would say that it's not used for any nuclear applications, really. Thank you.
There's a question. Do you see the question from Dr. Roland? The issue related to graphite lifetime with epithermal reactors?
Which I don't see it, I'm sorry.
David Roland has asked, what is the issue related to graphite lifetime with epithermal reactors?
I would direct you to, again, to the presentation of Elsa Merlicot. I suppose that you are referring to the epithermal molten salt reactor concept that was studied by the CNRS. What I know is that the lifetime span of the graphite under this condition was very low. And that meant, I don't have the values in mind, but really under 10 years perhaps. And it was deemed uneconomical to have to change the reactor every 10 years. Basically, you cannot just change the graphite inside the reactor. Thank you for your nice comments. I see Professor van der Doorpe, Professor Arbel, Professor Golub. Thank you very much for your interesting comments.
There's a question perhaps that we won't be able to answer. I'm not certain regarding why no more in the USA, but that may be more of of a political answer than anything else.
Okay, thank you. If please mark my email, and I would be more than happy to interact with you directly if you should have any questions. I'm finding hard to read the questions. Really, I'm having connectivity problems here. So.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Franco. Thank you very much for a very excellent presentation.
Thank you everybody for attending and for your patience. It was, I think, a long webinar, but okay. I hope you have find it useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Berta. Thank you, Amanda. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.